Do you want this chair? Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this morning's panel discussion. Quote, the current financial crisis and religion, what we can learn from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's a humble little title we've come up with, we know. Shouldn't take more than a day or two to get through it, so hope you've cleared your calendars for this. Michael DeWild, I'm the director of the Business Ethics Center here at Seidman. We're sponsoring this event along with the Kaufman Interfaith Institute and the Seidman College of Business itself. I want to acknowledge Doug Kinchy, who's the executive director of the Kaufman Institute, and thank him for his support. Thank you, Doug. And from the dean's office at Seidman, H. James Williams, the dean, who seized on this idea, Linda Anderson, Dana Lewis, Robbie Osipov, and Vani Herrera, without whom nothing happens that happens. I want to also thank Brian Bowe, Shelley Irwin, and Kelly Parker for their support. Just a quick note before I turn it over to Gerardo Wood, who's going to introduce the speakers, about other BEC events, Ethics Center events that are upcoming. February 16th in the Amway Symposium on the evolution of morality. We've got a couple of evolutionary psychologists and biologists coming to talk about what they're discovering about our innate moral sense and how that might relate to business and business practices. And then please do mark your calendars for Tuesday evening, March 30th. We hold our 4th annual Barry Castro Business Ethics Lecture. Our guest this coming year is Dr. Mary Gentili, who is the executive director of the Giving Voice to Values program, internationally renowned program that tends to emphasize not so much the decision-making process in terms of coming to understand what's right or wrong, but more once you know what the right thing to do is, how you actually go about doing it in the face of many obstacles, which is oftentimes, as we know, the harder thing to do. Last time I spoke with Dr. Gentili, she was consulting with General Motors, if that gives you any idea of how she's approaching this. I want to introduce Professor Gerardo Wood, whose idea this panel was. Professor Wood is adjunct professor in the philosophy department. He's an expert in the history of religious thought, and he will introduce this morning's speakers. Gerardo.
This is not a moment for platitudes, accolades, but the truth needs to be established. Professor DeWild mentioned that it was my idea that this event has taken place this morning, but it should be stated that he had been the epicenter of the logistics and the planning of this event. He had been in touch with the deans of business school, the philosophy department, and the Interreligious Institute. Without his help, this wouldn't have taken place. And therefore, I want to say thank you very much indeed from the bottom of my heart for this work. Dean Williams, heads of department, faculty, students, distinguished representatives of the financial, business, and religious communities, ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Barton once said, "No nation lives outside of its own history. To engage with history means also to situate oneself in the present. This means that the chill wind of financial and economic reality that is presently blowing cannot be denied. The market system we have established has fear, uncertainty, and insecurity at its core. Hence the topic for this morning's breakfast symposium, the current financial crisis on religion. What can we learn from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? If the financial institution must know the real world whose physical well-being and social relationships is its responsibility, and if it is therefore impossible for bankers and financial institutions to avoid becoming involved with religion, it necessarily follows that genuine listening and cooperation is desirable to enable human life. To have a legal and judicial inquiry into the financial crisis or turmoil is one thing. To have in place a banking system that subsumes ethical and moral principles for the well-being and social relationship is another. This morning, we are happy to have 3 scholars and a respondent who will enlighten us about how the religious perspective would help resolve the current financial crisis and hopefully avert the recurrence in the future. The first speaker is Dr. Sheldon Cockrell. He will speak on the topic Jewish Perspectives on Economic Ethics. He is trained in both the science and the humanities, and in the 1970s obtained a PhD in chemistry and history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He currently holds a joint appointment of Professor of Biomedical Sciences and Liberal Studies. His teaching and research interests are in the field of religious studies with special focus on Jewish studies. Dr. Cockrell is a member of the task force to formulate a religious studies major and minor program for the Grand Valley State University. Following Dr. Cockrell, the Very Reverend Father Mark David Jonas will speak on the subject Catholic Social Teaching on the Nature and Purpose of the Economy. Father Jonas is a Roman Catholic priest and clinical psychologist. He is a member of the monastic congregation of St. Paul the Apostle, otherwise known as the Paulist Fathers. He read philosophy and theology at the St. Paul Seminary in New York and the Catholic University of America. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1979. In addition to parish ministry, he worked as a team chaplain for university campus ministry, including Boston and Ohio State Universities. Father Jonas received a doctorate degree in clinical psychology from the University of Connecticut. Currently, Dr. Jonas holds a dual position of Director of the Catholic Information Center and Director of the Cathedral Church of St. Andrew in the Diocese of Grand Rapids. He is also an adjunct faculty at the College of Human Medicine in Michigan State University. He sits on the board of directors of the Divorce Colloquy for Medical Ethics. Our third speaker is Dr. Sharif Ahmed Sahib Zada. He will speak on the topic, perspectives and perception of the riba in Islamic faith. He is born in Kashmir, Pakistan. He's a citizen of the United Kingdom and now lives in the United States. In addition to being a religious and spiritual leader, Dr. Sahib Zada is a scholar of linguistics. His qualifications include graduate degrees in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Cairo, Egypt, Oriental languages from University of Punjab, and a postgraduate diploma in Semitic studies from the University of Leeds in England. Dr. Sahib Zada was awarded a PhD in Arabic and theology by the University of Leeds in England in 1977. He served on the faculty of the International Islamic University in Islamabad, Pakistan, until 2003, when he accepted a position in England. Dr. Sahib Zada is currently the director of the Islamic Center of West Michigan and the imam of the mosque in Grand Rapids. He is on a demand for speaking engagements in the US and Canada. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Jeff Cousy. He will respond to the three perspectives from the religious traditions. Dr. Cousy is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cousy Company. He is also a Fellow of the Business Ethics Center at Grand Valley State University. He obtained a law degree from the Virginia University, and he had been a professor of healthcare law at University of North Carolina. The event cannot take place without a moderator, and our moderator this morning is Professor John Ugulata of the Department of Philosophy, Grand Valley State University. Professor Ugulata is a lawyer and holds a PhD in philosophy. His teaching and research interests lie in moral philosophy and political social theory. He directs, advises, and counsels pre-law students in Grand Valley State University. Without a judicious moderator, how can we hold a symposium? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers and moderator.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to go through all our speakers one by one first, and we'll be available. They'll all be here for questions afterwards, but please do hold your questions until the end. So we'll begin. Dr. Caparro.
It's a pleasure to be here this morning, but I really am a bit perplexed in terms of one issue that I really can't go on till this is solved. Do any of you know whether Punxsutawney Phil saw a shadow this morning? Did? Okay. I'm afraid to announce then that we have 6 more weeks of winter yet to go. I do want to thank the sponsoring organizations for inviting me to speak today, and I do want to just for a moment pay tribute to my former colleague at Grand Valley and Temple member at Temple Emmanuel, Barry Castro, who was the founder of the Seidman Business Ethics Center and the first director of the institution. It's a pleasure to talk about Jewish perspectives on the economic crisis. Notice that I say perspectives because there really isn't one perspective. Judaism is known for many things, including the tradition of debate and discussion, and even though you may not arrive at a conclusion satisfactory to everybody, it is important to recognize that matters are debated in the open and freely. I think one of the interesting things about the priority that the Jewish tradition sets for business honesty is the fact that according to the Talmud, which was a massive compilation of biblical commentary put together in the first few centuries of the Common Era, when a person dies and goes to heaven, the question that the person is asked first is, were you honest in your business dealings? Only secondly is the question, did you spend enough time and set aside time every day for studying Torah and for prayer and contemplation about God? So the priority clearly is on honesty in business dealings. I think that it's important to recognize that in the Bible, the Torah, which are the first 5 books of Moses, many of the legal codes that are included there are interspersed between business dealings and ritual law. Many people think that some of the Torah, particularly the book of Leviticus, is made up of ritual law that talks about sacrifices, the kind of animal offerings in the days of the temple, and a lot of rather detailed discussions of strict laws with very little interest in the everyday and particularly the business world. Well, that's not so at all. In fact, it's interesting that in chapters 19 through 26 of Leviticus, much of what's contained in there is what's called the Holiness Code. The section begins by saying, you shall be holy because the Lord your God is holy. And in the idea that man was made in the image of God, it's important to recognize that just as God is holy, so shall humankind try to retain a holiness. And this includes dealings with the world around us. So that we find, for example, fairly early on in the section, the notion that accurate weights and measures shall be used in all business dealings. And when people come around to inspect, they inspect not only the sharpness of the knife that's used in ritual slaughter for making sure that the meat that's used is kosher according to the strict guidelines, but that same inspector will also, and even more importantly, check the weights and measures of every business person. A second thing is the notion that you should not deceive your neighbor, or anyone else for that matter. When you set a price for an item, it's reasonable to make a fair profit, but you can't go beyond a certain amount. You have to keep it within what's considered fair market value. To put it elsewhere, or in different terms, no price gouging. This is a very important principle that you're not supposed to do anything of that sort. Another thing that's forbidden, according to Leviticus, is verbal deception. This is the idea that you should not take time away from a shopkeeper or a businessman to engage him in idle gossip or even talking about business if you have no intention of buying anything. The example here is you should not go into a store that sells computers and it's a more expensive store, so they will give you a free demonstration of the value. Let's say you want to buy an iPad in the next when it's introduced. You go to a store where the technicians are trained in showing you all the benefits of this product. yet you know in your heart of hearts that you're going to turn around after seeing what it can do, and if you decide to buy, you're going to go to the discount store down the street. The Torah forbids your taking up the time of this businessman, even though you know you're not going to do business with him. You shouldn't even technically go into a store and ask the price of an item if you know you're not going to buy it. Another commandment that's very important is stealing a person's mind, as the rabbis of the Talmud called it. This is by deceptive packaging. You go into a store and you see boxes of beautiful strawberries. You should not package your produce in such a way that the beautiful strawberries form the top row and below them are rotted specimens. Another famous line, not too far removed, just a couple verses away from the important concept of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is a commandment not to set a stumbling block before the blind. Now that can be taken literally, but it's been broadened in Jewish rabbinic interpretation. This means that you shouldn't in any way put temptation in front of somebody knowing that by doing so you are leading him or her astray. In other words, you shouldn't, knowing that the investment that you are going to counsel your client is a rather shaky one, you shouldn't promise everything that you can't really deliver. And finally, one of the most important concepts, and this is familiar too in Christianity, the law of the land is the law. So the tax evasion in any form is absolutely forbidden in the Jewish tradition. Last year, as the financial crisis was peaking in March, an important meeting was held in New York City by a group of scholars as well as business persons and people involved in the social community. And they got together to try to discuss what the Jewish position is on economic policy, and actually to see whether in the Jewish tradition there might be reasons to explain the economic crisis. Some of the financial experts argued that it's most important to make money in an honest way, but they found little wrong with having executives make more than 400 times as much as the average worker. The other view, which seemed to hold sway, and the view which I think most Jews agree with, is the notion that each person is in the image of God, and each work is valued so differently. The crisis began, say these people, with this unconscionable rise in executive salaries, and without any concern about how the Jewish ethic would play out in society. Today, in the Middle Ages, the Jewish community functioned like the government, taxing wealthy members to provide for those who do not have. But there is today a strong moral and ethical concern about out-of-control government spending. And so once again, we have two different views being portrayed. That government has an obligation to help people out of the crisis, yet at the same time we have to avoid massive runaway spending that will carry the debt down to our children and grandchildren. I think that the most dominant view, though, was the concept that social justice is of primary importance. The people who argued for that quoted the prophets, the prophet Nathan, who, when he scolded King David for his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, did not talk about the need for cleaning up your personal life. Instead, he used an analogy from the business world. How can you rob a poor farmer of his one lamb while you, the wealthy man, have dozens of sheep that you could make available? The prophet Amos talks about crushing and trampling the poor, and the prophet Isaiah in a number of places makes similar comments. So I think that one very important aspect of the Jewish community and Jewish views is the notion of social justice and social action, which we get from the prophetic tradition. I would be amiss if I didn't mention that one of the big topics was concern over whether something in the Jewish community and the way they interpreted business ethics was responsible for the success of Bernard Madoff, a name that I'm sure is only too familiar to all of us. The Jewish view is that each one of us is born not in original sin, but with a good inclination and an evil inclination, and our life is spent, individual lives are spent, trying to do good, trying to make the good inclination fight off the evil inclination. The belief here is that Madoffs of the world were possible because too many people forgot that and were interested in going after big investors, big donors, and trying to make it seem as though these people were going to get something for nothing. And of course, you don't need a Jewish perspective to recognize that, but there was a good deal of concern that anyone who feels that way could become a potential Bernard Madoff. To sum up, the Jewish tradition talks about the good businessman who does well by doing good. In other words, he or she leads the ethical life, and by doing so, succeeds in business. But the true Torah-keeping Jewish business person goes beyond that. He or she does good by doing well. The fact that he or she has become wealthy and successful in business is just a starting point. And the ideal Jewish business person will then see to it that his or her wealth is put to good use and allow the entire community to do good. By doing good, allow the entire community to do well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Copperell. Dr. Jennings?
Okay. Good morning. I'm not sure, just to say at the outset, I'm not sure it's very wise to take economic advice from someone who begs for a living. That being said, I was at a discussion at the Fisher School of Business down at the Ohio State University, where it was my privilege to teach for a number of years, and remarking to a group of young students in economics and in business that de facto, that they are the new moral theologians. That in the way in which our world works today, and the way in which the world has grown so very small at the same time, it's so very large, that what occurs really within the life of business and the life of economics has a great deal to do for setting the tone of what's possible and what's available within the moral life. So since whether you have claimed this as your own responsibility or not, it is nonetheless. So what advice might the Roman Catholic tradition have towards those of you who have this massive responsibility for the world in which we now live? I want to share with you, primarily from the Roman Catholic perspective, that's the area in which I have particular expertise. Christianity, of course, is much broader than Roman Catholicism. There's the Orthodox tradition and the great Protestant tradition. But from the Roman Catholic tradition, we have a series of principles about the nature of a society, the nature of the economy, and the nature of the individual that at least to keep into consideration as you will, the de facto moral theology is lived out in the world of business. From the Roman Catholic perspective, the central piece, the starting piece, is for us a given. The human person is made in the image and likeness of God. That our orientation, everything flows from our understanding of the human person as having an inherent, not only inherent dignity, but inherent sacredness because of their creation in the image and likeness of God. The value of the human person is not something that comes from us. It's not a value, a dignity we can bestow upon one another. It is a value and a dignity that is bestowed by God and that we recognize and that we honor. It's not our gift. That society, since human beings are social creatures, we're not bull moose who just meet occasionally, but we are societal creatures. Society has to organize itself in a way to enable people to know, love, and serve God and one another. That is indeed the purpose of the society, so that people have that opportunity. Because individuals have this inherent value to God, this primary value to God, individuals are not cogs in anyone's machine, whether it be the state or whether it be the church or whether it be any economic set of principles. That individuals are sacrosanct, they are primary, this is where one begins, and this is what we are in service of. Given that, the second set of principles that Catholicism suggests to you is that human rights, there are some basic human rights that must be protected and must be promoted. First among these, of course, is the right to life, which we interpret from conception to natural death and all the issues that are in between. Second among those is a right to have a family and to live in a united family. In a united family, not just to have a family, but that family should be united, which will explain, just at the outset, and will much of what the Roman Catholic Church's positions are going to be in reference to refugees and to immigrants, for example. They've come from the desire to have a united family. That the individuals have a right to develop one's intelligence and to search for the truth. This is really very significant. The Catholic intellectual tradition holds that the use of the intelligence that is given to each person must be developed. That is what people owe the Lord, and that we must enable people to be able to develop their intelligence so that they can give a sufficient gift back. And that search for the truth includes religious freedom, including those who choose no religion whatsoever, for error even has rights in this. That the ability to be able to construct a society where people have the opportunity to be educated, to search for the truth, even includes the right for them to do it if we think it is inaccurate. The right to work. I'm going to speak more about the right to work in a little bit, but critical is a right to work. Work is seen in the Roman Catholic perspective is not only an obligation, a duty, something that one must do in order to be able to survive, but it's also part of one's cooperation, really, with God. That it being entrusted with the Garden of Eden, the right to work is a right to participate in God's ongoing creative process. And that work is one of the most significant gifts that someone has. It is one of the most significant gifts that God returns to God, that a human being gives to God. It is one of the most significant gifts that a human being gives to another. So the right to work is also related to the process by which human beings relate to God and relate to one another. The right to work has some boundaries, however, because the right to work, the work that one engages in, the creative process that one is part of, has to respect the good use of shared resources of the earth. Now, in Vatican speak, those are loaded code words, and we might break those down a little bit later. But the right to work, the right to the creative process, has to do with the good use of the shared resources of the earth. So there are some valences that the right to work has to respect, and the person engaging in work really has to respect. The right to work, the right to that process where one makes that contribution, has to be able to have the ability to support oneself and to support one's family. People have an obligation to be able to be able to pull their own weight, if you will, but also to be able to provide for one's family. And within the last 40 years, the Catholic Church has articulated as part of that a right to health care. Now, the center part, the first principle, is the principle of the importance of the individual, and that individual growing to know, love, and serve God, and a society organizing itself to preserve those rights of individual. That those rights are nested within a principle of Catholicism called the common good. The purpose of a society, and the only reason for society to exist, is for the common good. Individuals do not live in isolation. In fact, individuals find their fulfillment of their destiny only in relation to one another. So individual rights are relational dialogic, essentially, because the exercise of an individual right, of an individual life, by necessity, finds its good only in relationship with others. So the common good of all members of society is an essential responsibility of each individual. Each person must contribute to the common good. One cannot define an individual good in Roman Catholic perspective without understanding one's relationship to the common good. And someone's individual responsibility is to contribute to the common good. We exist in and for others. The responsibility for the common good falls equally upon the individual and upon the state. In fact, the common good is the only reason why the state exists. There is within the common good what we call a universal destination of goods, okay? Meaning that goods are intended, the goods that come from God are intended for all of God's people without partiality. Human beings cannot do without the material goods that correspond to their primary needs and constitute the basic conditions of existence. The universal destination of goods, that principle is an invitation to develop an economic vision that's inspired by these moral values. How is it that one distributes the goods of the earth so that individuals can be able to have their primary needs met and their basic conditions of existence met? The Christian tradition within this sense of common goods, however, also recognizes the right to individual property. And that's absolute, and we consider untouchable, so that so that the common goods are there, they're to be distributed, but people also have a right to individual property. Let me speak more about the fourth point a little bit, and this has to do with the right to work as a fundamental right, and spend a bit of time on that. Work in the Roman Catholic tradition is a duty for each person. Each person needs to be able to use the intelligence they have, the resources at their disposal, to be able to return to God what God has given to them. And part of that return to God is to care for the common good of one another. So the work that one does is work that enhances the life of others, as well as to be able to provide for your own survival. Because of that, full employment should be the primary goal of every society. And every society should have as a primary goal an education system which enables people to develop their responsibilities, enables people to be able to develop their intelligence so that they can produce the most fruitful work possible for the common good and for their own participation in the creative work of God. A just wage is a legitimate fruit of this work. The laborer is worthy of his hire, it says in the Gospels. Workers have a right to organize, they have a right to strike, but they also have an obligation to give a fair day's work according to the contract that they've engaged in. So the right to organize is guaranteed. The right to strike, to withhold work is guaranteed, but implied in that and central in that is the obligation to to the best of your capacity to fulfill the contract that you make with the employer. In areas and in arenas where there are conflicts, and there are always conflicts, in areas of conflicts, human capital is always considered to be more important than financial capital. The fifth principle I would like to share with you is that economic activity and material progress must be placed at the service of humanity and of humanity's society. What are riches for? Riches are destined to produce benefits for others, to improve human development and human solidarity. Everyone has a right to their own economic initiative. Everyone has a right to harvest the just fruits of their labors. But the purpose of labor, the purpose of economic activity, is to produce benefits for others and to improve human development and solidarity. So businesses, the Catholic tradition holds, should be characterized by their capacity to serve the common good through the production of useful goods and services. Let me just repeat that one more time. Businesses should be characterized by their capacity to serve the common good through production of useful goods and services. An economy that's designed as an end in and of itself contradicts the moral goals of serving the human community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Janitz. Dr. Sahibzada.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. All praise to God. We seek His help, ask for His forgiveness. All the time He guides us because He has created us and He draws our attention. You work together on the basis of righteousness and piety and do not work together on the basis of sin and transgression. A financial system has to be based on some principle, and the most important is this one, that social economic justice to be put into operation and extended to all members of society regardless of any distinction. Eradication of injustice and exploitation of financial sources. Linguistically, the word riba you will hear more in my speak. Riba means usury or interest. Linguistically, the word riba means to increase, and it has been referred so many times in the Word of God, because the basic for the guidance are two things for the human being. It's a word of God and word of a prophet. So word of God has got the priority, and word of prophet is always the practice and the practices that we have to present. So the word of this word riba has been mentioned so many times in the Quran clearly, that God advises us that what we have to do and what is our direction, where we have to go. And I will read some. Those who ingest riba will not stand except as stand one whom the evil one by his touch has driven to madness. That is because they say, trade is like riba, but God has permitted trade and forbidden riba. Those who after receiving direction from their Lord desist shall be pardoned for the past. Their case is for God to judge, but those who repeat the offense are companion of the fires. Then again, God explains this, that God eradicates riba and increases charity, and God does not love sinful believers. God carries on. So many verses are over there that we have to pay attention, that these word riba is being explained that it is unlawful. It is not allowed for the human being to exploit other people who are needy and poor, and they cannot join in the society. So this was in practice in the human being. In the light of God's commandment and Prophet's words, it is clear and sound to say the riba is haram, unlawful. It was enforced soon after migration due to its existence. There are some kinds of riba, and most common was riba al-jahiliya, the riba which was used before the Islamic era or before the revelation of Quran. And this is such riba which is the prohibited one. Riba an-nasiya is what was well known and conventional among the Arabs in Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic time. They used to give loan on condition that every month they will receive a stipulated amount with the whole principal remaining outstanding. Then when the loan matured and the borrower was unable to clear his obligation, the amount was raised and the period was extended. This is the riba that was practiced in the Jahiliyyah. And this is riba which is not allowed for the human society, that they have to suck the blood of other people. The impact of riba on the lives of the people and its oppressiveness cannot be denied. In the name of the profit-taking, people have been pushed into corner to pay money to lenders in riba-based system. This has created the culture of selfishness, stinginess, mercilessness, and hardness of the heart. Riba is a mindset that creates self-centeredness, exploiting the situation and making money out of people's needs. Riba brings up such culture which is completely based on greed, hypocrisy, in opposition to principle of faith. It is unarguably a tool of oppression. Religion prohibits ingesting people's money unjustly and considers riba a way of theft. That recent meltdown of financial system is the best relevant example for above mentioned evil, which suck the mankind. Religion promotes charity. The riba-based system can be understood with the following commandment. God says that if you are going to do something good to the people, to your brothers and to your neighbors, that you have to give a money on loan for a certain time. When the time comes, you have to extend that time of the period. And if that time they are not allowed to pay anything, then you have to show mercy and kindness, being a brother and sister and the creation of the God. And if you are being asked what you have to spend, then God says you have to forgive them or pardon them and write off everything which you have given to them. One of the main objects of divine law is to test his servant to see if he obeys God or not. As God said, and we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the steadfast. You will surely be tested in your possessions, in yourselves. In this context of the following point may be considered seriously. Protect the wealth of the people so that no one takes it away by illegal means, as today riba is legalized even when it is inherently unjust and illegal. Religion is pure and it promotes purity in food, in life, in spending, in earning, in thoughts. Its purpose is to purify us inwardly and outwardly. Hence, it asks people to find pure and just ways to earn money where is no injustice or disguise. One man's earning should not be other man's loss. Riba creates environment of selfishness and all other evils. Religion promotes charity and helping other with kindness. Prohibition riba gives opportunity to people to help the needy in their tough times by giving them loans without interest, and further helps them by not extending terms if they are unable to pay, and if they cannot pay, then forgive that loan as a charity. This is just being human and acting like one. There are some other details, but I go to the conclusion that there are some points I have to make. The law means the religious law or the Sharia. The law prohibits riba in all its forms. Riba is a tool of oppression that allows sourceful person to suck the blood of poor and needy. Riba consumer is at war with God and his prophet. Linguistically, the word riba means to increase, to grow, to exceed, to be more. The basic example of riba is in monetary credit transaction where borrower has to pay interest on loaned amount. In the law, riba is a term that is used when two parties exchange items of same kind and in return one party receives extra. Riba is opposite to charity, while it seems to riba consumer that their money increases with riba, but reality money decreases with riba and money increases only with charity. This is testified by God in his words. However, a riba ingesting person cannot grasp such guidance from God. The law promotes charity and forgiveness. If a needy person cannot repay loan, it is considered an act of excellence to forgive his loan. Riba cannot be justified by any reason. It is neither like a trade, nor like a rent, nor profit. In fact, it is a reward of inactiveness where lender wants to make money without working. There are some points I want to raise that the consultation and the research study in financial system based on faith should be enhanced. A comparative research institute must be established to achieve goals. Such institute may be started in the Department of Religion, and Grand Valley State University should take such an initiative following Princeton, Harvard, Claremont, and McGill in Canada. Further guidance and help can be obtained from following universities: International Islamic University, Islamabad, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Kuwait; King Abdulaziz University, Jeddah; Azhar University, Cairo; Aligarh University in India. A combined Sharia board must be set up consisting of God-fearing faith scholars of financial system, economists, and top finance expert of capitalism throughout the world. Lastly and finally, saving one soul is saving of all humankind, and spreading of riba is spoiling of a human being spiritually, ethically, and financially. And finally, I will finish it with the word of God, and God says, we are praying and demanding and asking for him, our Lord, give us the best in this world and in the hereafter, and save us from the punishment of fire and transgression of evil mind. Thank you.
But I was once a lawyer, and I think I would start, and a law professor, I think it's worth starting just with a teeny bit of history, and I'm actually, our moderator is probably more expert on this than I, so feel free to chime in. Just to sort of, I think, frame a little bit of the context for this conversation. It's been the project of Anglo-American law for 400 years, perhaps, to drain from commercial transactions former cultural and religious constraints of all kinds. There was a time when commerce was highly regulated in local communities by all kinds of what today we would view as moral and ethical constraints. We also might view some of them as kind of odd constraints. But nevertheless, the project of Anglo-American law has been to drain any ethical content from commercial relationships. Now, there are certainly exceptions to that, but for the most part, the project of contract law has been just to say, well, what is the intent of the party? To enforce the intent of the parties. They are permitted to agree to whatever kind of stuff they want to. And the role of commercial law is just to make sure that they're, to regulate fraud, make sure there's some equality between the parties, and to sort of divorce itself from any notion of whether the subject matter of the parties or the terms of the deal were fair, representative. You're entitled to make whatever kind of deal that you can. And I think that there's an interesting relationship between sort of law and ethics, that is, and law and morality, that is, what we think we should do and then what is, in fact, permitted, and I think that the project of law and finance, aided and abetted by fine business schools, has been to sort of promote a rationale and an ethic of a deal's a deal. And short of any coercion or fraud, the party should live by the terms. Last week, two real estate firms, Tishman Speyer in New York and BlackRock Capital, defaulted on their $5.4 billion purchase of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village in New York City. That was a 56-building, 11,000-unit apartment complex on 80 acres. Those two parties put up, between the two of them, $224 million, a little less than 4% of the total purchase price. And they decided just to flip the keys back to the lenders. The property is now estimated to be worth about $1.8 billion. So now, BlackRock is a publicly held company. It's accountable to its shareholders. I think $112 million to them, which was their loss, is equivalent of the change that we might find in our couches at home. An interesting example, though, Tishman Speyer is held privately, and Jerry Speyer, who's the head of that, is a very prominent New Yorker. He will not lose his seat on the Museum of Modern Art Board. He will not be removed from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He will not be booted off of the board of New York Presbyterian Hospital or the board of Rand Corporation or of Siemens. And his future opportunities to take those jobs will probably be only marginally diminished by participating in the most colossally bad real estate deal in the history of mankind. And I think that is largely the way it is. Now, that's different from saying that that's the way things should be. And please don't believe that I am saying that. So I guess by way of response, here is my response to the comments and perhaps a suggestion about how to go forward. At least my view of what the most fruitful path is. First, it is clear that these religious traditions and others that may have been apparent here provide a rich font of ethical and philosophical and moral thought that an individual business person can draw upon in the formation of his or her individual character, and particularly in going, if they desire, to go beyond the minimum requirements of the law and the market. And there are, in this community, I think, plenty of people who are in business who do that. They do, in fact, go above and beyond and aspire to some kind of moral excellence. There are others who do not, but that is a fruitful source. The other side, so I'll distinguish there the personal from what I would call the political, and I heard all three speakers touch on this in one way or the other. And to say that, to a certain extent, the financial crossroads we've got ourselves to has, in my view, been the product of an ideology that essentially says where we should go is wherever the free market takes us. That should be the place. We should all want to go there. If we pursue maximum economic freedom, that place sort of by definition will be a good place to arrive, where we will have the best sort of society that we can have. That is not a view that I share. What I want to say is, in this case, as an American in a liberal democracy which has many values other than market values, that we should decide where we wish to go and use the market as a tool to get there. Now, there's plenty of room for debate about what that would mean, but we have a political marketplace in which to do that. And to me, that is where this game is. Now, in response to the financial crisis, Grand Valley has put a lot of effort, other business schools, into what can we do about the horrible moral character of our financial leaders. And I'm not against working that project. What I'm suggesting is that the ethic of the global financial empire that we have now is largely immune to a project of personal character reform and of raising up a new class of capitalists. like I say, I think that would be useful, but I think at the end of the day, it's politics. And part of what we have lost is an effective politics and really any meaningful discussion about what the market is in fact for, where it is appropriate to pursue aggressive market ethics, and I think there are lots of places, and where it is necessary in the service of other goals to step back from that. That's it, I'm done. I wasn't sure where it would end since I was just responding, but I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you. All speakers. Now, the speakers are going to remain for questions, but we recognize that some people may need to leave, so please, if you must, feel free to leave anytime you wish during the question and answer session. And I'll take questions here, so I will point you out, but I'll pause for a second if anyone needs to leave right away.
analogous to a fast-moving stream. And as the global economy ties everyone together, that stream is bigger and bigger, maybe more muddier and moves slower than individual countries' streams have seen move in the past. But the focus, the religious focus, a lot of times is on the eddies, the side currents, the flotsam and jetsam that seems to not move with the current, rather sometimes even moves backwards. And the social order requirement of the stream is that it acknowledged is the fact that the movement of the stream, the direction of the stream, the speed of the stream is dependent on the sides, the currents that come into it, the eddies and the things that support the stream but do not move with it, sometimes even move counter to its stream. And as long as a stream does not acknowledge, it does not support those side currents, those things that are somewhat left behind, the stream is not able to gain its speed or its direction that it should. And somehow, the people that are caught up in the stream, the faster it goes, the more difficult it is to pick up the side currents to understand it. And the debate should be that people in a social system be aware of what's going on the sides, and to the degree that they're aware, to that same degree that system is moving in a moral direction. It's almost a biological necessity that the stream take care of the sides. And I just wondered if the folks on the panel would comment about that, because it seems to be so difficult for people to look, especially the people that are in the movement of the stream, to look to the side and see what's going on around. The more centered they are in this high-speed stream, the more Anne Randian they are, the less they seem to see what's going on. The more power they have, the more focus people put on them, and the less they perceive what's going on around them.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone in particular wants to jump on that one, or seems like everyone spoke
I
to
think
that one.
to use your analogy, I think the problem is even in the definition of it. I mean, from our perspective, it's from the Roman Catholic perspective anyway. I think it's the stream is headed somewhere, and if it's not headed somewhere, then what the hell difference does it make? Quite frankly. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, free market capitalism is wonderful, but it's a tool. It's not the end. It's not the goal, unless it becomes the goal. You know, I mean, one could say that if it's correct that the purpose of Anglo-Saxon law has been to remove ethics from deal making, it's probably the most remarkable, successful social enterprise in the history of humankind, because it's done a very good job of that. And I think the question is now, where are we going, and why are we going there? And on all three religious traditions, from here, we're all from the Abrahamic faiths, have said, well, there are some principles and goals. And if you remove some of those principles and goals at the outset, then it's free-flowing water going wherever it is. Now, we call that a flood. And in our scriptures, floods are not good for us.
I think we have to concentrate on 2 points, that we are all the creation of God. And God has provided us the guidance. And whatever word of God is, that's the betterment, for the betterment of the humanity. So those who obey that system, which is God-given, they will succeed. Those who will obey and go on the other side, which is the open enemy of the human being, that's the Satan. So Satan's mind is always working 24/7 to misguide us. So these are 2 systems, we have 2 points we have to make it. And we don't have to think under certain umbrella that we are Muslims, are Christians, are the Jewish, and the others. We have to think under the guidance of the God, which is the best for the humanity, and we can live best, and we have to devise such a system which is for the betterment of the humanity, not such system which is sucking the blood of the poor and the needies, and we are producing such products, and we are making them attractive to others, that you have to buy, you have to use, and you have to, and then we also provide the credit for that one, and when the time comes, then the meltdown of the financial recession comes. So it is our duty as a human being and a believer of God, all the faiths, that we have to look what guidance comes from our Creator, and then as a good human being, we have to sit and consider what is the best system that can make us successful.
I think that the idea here is that we do need to look carefully at the flotsam and jetsam, to continue your analogy, and determine whether this is telling us that we are allowing that flood to happen. This could be a very useful reason to slow down. If the flotsam and jetsam represents the trampling of the poor, or showing us that there are needs of other people to consider, maybe the slowing down of the stream is a good thing. So again, I think that a lot has to do with the nature of what those things are that are causing the obstacles in this free-flowing path. I think the Father Mark David was correct when he said, traditionally floods are not good things in all of our traditions.
Sir.
The question on the amassing of funds for the family, and one spoke about the family together. There are a couple of, in the Jewish tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it's a wonderful, in Proverbs, a wonderful thing to provide for your children's children. So there's a generational concept. In the New Testament, 1 Timothy 5:8 talks about he who does not provide for his household is worse than an infidel. So we have some principles. Maybe you have some others. The question is, how much should a family amass, is there a rule of thumb, so that he can provide for his wife and children and maybe a little for the grandchildren, without amassing so much that it's taking away from providing for the poor and the needy in the surrounding community? And what is the role of government in limiting that through taxation or through legalities in a person determining that?
Thank you.
According to Talmudic thought, which approaches that from basis of the Bible, the Torah, in the Jewish tradition, it's important to recognize that while generosity is important to giving to the poor, there are limits that are stated by the rabbis as to how much you are allowed to give. If you give, and again, it's hard to quantify because every situation might be different, but certainly the need is there to provide for your family first, and then work outward from those closest to you. But there is generally considered that approximately 20% of one's income should be given to the poor right off the top, and people are advised not to go much beyond that. But the notion is, as you say, that in order to keep you and your family from becoming dependent on charity, you have to save enough before you give to the poor. Now, that's not very helpful in giving quantitative answers, but the principle, as you state, is clearly discussed, and it is a concern.
As I started with, I think I'm full of advice about how you can spend your money. And that does not make me unique. I mean, there are many people who have that. But I would rather than, deal with in terms of percentages and things like that, I would say that the question is, there's, again, some operative principles. Wealth is for something. And the family doesn't exist apart from the society in which it exists. And that people are certainly entitled to be able to receive the just wage for the work that they do. And the question always is, what is this for? And how is it that one ensures that one is participating in a just distribution of what are the Earth's shared resources? Now that's some of that's going to be limited by our own individual moral goodness, because some of us are endlessly Mother Teresa, and some of us, John Rockefeller thought it was great when he gave a dime to somebody. So there's individual variances with that. But part of it has to do with an understanding of, well, what is this for? You have this. What is the purpose of it? What is your purpose in relationship to the greater whole, to the greater good? Your family is part of the greater whole and the greater good, but it's not all the greater whole and greater good. That there's more that's engaged with it. What is the purpose of what you've received, and what do you think you're supposed to be doing with that? It has to do with the nature of what you think your work is for in the first place. Why are you working? And how do you see the purpose and the valence of the work and the receipts that you have of that? That has to do with that larger issue. Why are we doing this? And once you have a sense of why we're doing this, then some of those other issues sort of come into play.
In this lifetime, there are responsibilities, and we have to see those responsibilities. First responsibility lies with the family. And if you take a family, then it's an individual family, then you become in a village, then a city, then a country, then the whole world. So you have to ascertain which responsibility is most important for you under the God-given guidance. First is the family. And God says, if you have to spend, what you have to spend extra from your daily necessities. First, you have to spend on the family. Then whatever is extra, you have to give it to the poor and the needy person. And the rule for this one is that out of each $100, every wealthy person, according to the means and sources, has to calculate the whole wealth each year at the 31st of December. So out of each $100, everybody who can afford it, they have to pay $2.50 to the poor. In this way, the charity works. This is obligatory part obligatory part that every believer has to do it. But others are optional one as well. You can do optional as much as you can. If your neighbor is hungry or your next door person is hungry, so you are eating, so you have to think about that one. So these are the two responsibility we have to. One is the obligatory one, and other one is the optional one. After all, we have to seek the pleasure of God. To seeking the pleasure of God, we have to submit and surrender to His commandment for the betterment of the mankind. So the charity and whatever the system, they goes along with it, but most priority has got the charity, that you have to look after others as well, and that you can help the needy ones.
I have a question related to the last comments about the Tishman Speyer, BlackRock walk-away on the financing in New York City. Would the panel members please comment and distinguish between that attitude, which is permitted under non-recourse financing for commercial transactions, versus the attitude toward individuals, homeowners who are underwater and are implored not to walk away from the financing on their homes, where they have the legal right to do so under the documentation for the mortgages. Why should they not drop the keys at the door of the lender and walk away and be absolved of responsibility if Tishman Speyer, BlackRock can in fact do the same thing? Notwithstanding the details of our bankruptcy law, which apparently do not permit the bankruptcy courts from renegotiating the terms of the mortgage and absolving the individuals of that responsibility.
Can I take that one first? Because I was really hoping someone would raise this issue. And I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. Here's, I'm not a finance scholar, but here's what I would say. I would say there's no difference between the Tishman and the mortgage, because part of what you do in a commercial lending contract today is you implicitly, you don't just get a loan at a rate of interest. And I would say this is true of a credit card, it's true of a mortgage, it's true of a car loan. You implicitly purchase an option to default. And in fact, the lender has more knowledge about the pricing of that option when they are making that offer to you, I will loan you this amount of money at this interest, than you could ever have as an individual. So they have all the knowledge and they have all the authority. Now, there may be other constraints. Some of those may be personal character restraints. I'm okay with that. But from a strictly finance perspective, you've already paid for the right to walk away, in my view, now, the legal regimes are different state by state and everything else. Interestingly enough, I made this exact point when I was teaching business ethics last semester. Upper level, mostly seniors, Grand Valley students. There was not a single one who bought that argument. So notions of individual responsibility, and these are, finance majors, have incredible cultural traction. And it was, Professor DeWald was there, he saw it, I have a witness. And not only that, a substantial minority of them actually believed the crisis, they all believed at some level the crisis was caused by irresponsible borrowers. And there were probably 3 to 5 of the students who believed in particular it was poor and minority borrowers who were responsible for this. So it was kind of they will have that when they get their MBAs and go out to Wall Street, that at least in practice those beliefs burned out of them. But to me it was just the most interesting experience I've had in a long time. Yeah, it was just fascinating. I'm still scratching my head over what's going on.
Again, now, I know nothing about financial law other than what I know from being a homeowner. However, I do think that if we're going to look at a religious perspective, here again, the individuals who have gotten up over their heads due to their own foolishness, that's one thing, but I do think that a number of people in good faith did take out mortgages on homes at rates that seemed, well, maybe if it's too good to be true, it isn't. But there are a number of people who are finding their heads underwater on this because of the not so much because of what they have done, but because of the nature of the collapsing banks and financial institutions. And these are the people for whom, yes, according to the law, the banks are not being forced to renegotiate, but from a religious perspective, shouldn't they be? And I would say that according to most of the Jewish tradition dealing, as I said before, with the social justice issue, this is a strictly moral issue where the government, the law, should help these people out. And I see a very, at least from my perspective, I see a big difference between the individual homeowner and these folks you are talking about who own the hundreds of the buildings at 88th Street in New York City.
Well, I'm from New York City. I grew up on 71st Street. It's not so bad. There's two pieces that are here, and I think, again, within Catholic social teaching, social teaching is social teaching. There's individual morality, and then there's social morality. There's two different arenas with that. And I think when we look at individual actions, they're nested within the social context. You know, I mean, to use the gentleman's analogy, you know, it's not like someone's in their little boat going down a serene stream, you know, with a drill in the boat trying to empty it. It's like the stream, they're not the only boat in the stream, and there's motivation, and there are things that are moving the stream. There are contracts that are part of it that are more tidal waves than they are a gentle stream. And a number of people are part of that. So I think the question really isn't just what is someone's individual sense of responsibility. That's one tack. And actually, Christians, you know, are really good, and everything is individual responsibility. But part of what social ethics are about is that as a group, collectively, socially, there is a social ethic, there is a social doctrine, or there's not. And it's very difficult to find people to behave responsibly individually when socially as a whole the social doctrine is just a maelstrom. I mean, I don't care how good you are at canoeing. If the stream is a rapids, you're not going to do that well. Most folks aren't going to be able to do that. So I think there's two levels here. There's an individual level, and that's, you know, fine. That's good. You know, great Calvinist worth ethic. You know, and that's all that stuff is fine. But there's a macro level. There's a social level in which individual lives are lived. And I think that's the part where my comment to the young folks at the Fisher College of Business that economic and business principles have a lot to do with what the speed of the stream is, and what the constraints are in terms in which people are having to make their individual decisions. That's a level of thinking that we're not very good at, and that we're not very good at holding ourselves accountable. We're very good at holding individual people accountable, but we're not very good at saying when there's more than two or three of us together, how is it that we've set these things in motion?
I think accountability begins from the individual itself. That person who is honest to himself and honest to others. Whatever the laws are being made in the financial system, I'm not expert, but this is my view, that all the laws and system and products are made only to benefit the lender. And the folks and common people, they are not aware of it, and also they are being enticed that you have to get this product. So this is happening in the market, that all the laws are for the benefit of the lenders, and when the borrower comes and it's entangled in that product, so he is in loss totally. I think we are not sincere to ourselves and not sincere to others, and we are not fearing God, that at the end of the day we will be accountable to God. If we are accountable to God, then we deal everything honestly and sincerely, and we make those laws which also benefit the common folks. I think we can straighten the market as well.
I'm intrigued with Jeff's analysis of the history of Anglo-American contract law. It's analogous to a field that I'm more familiar with, and that is science. There's this idea that science is value-free, that science only is looking for truth and it doesn't bring values to it. While that's been questioned, of course, it seems to, in many scientific related issues, it seems to devolve to the government then just to act on behalf of the people in terms of what are the values, what are the limits, where do we put the limits. So the question I have for the panel is, religions, especially in our pluralistic society, tend to be individualistic. We tend to influence individuals. What is the responsibility of the three religious traditions? To influence government, to influence the institution that does set the boundaries for either our science or our financial constraints.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start that off by saying that while there are exceptions, probably for better or for worse, the so-called Jewish vote in America has been known for ever since I've been old enough to understand it, and even before then, to support the notion of a government to take an active role in promoting civil rights and individual rights. And so that's why we find that so many of the Jewish community favor social action. I don't want to say, although I suppose the statistics would bear this out, that Jews naturally follow the democratic line. I know many people in our temple who vote strongly conservative, but for the most part, the Jewish tradition with the social action, the importance of the prophets in our understanding, where it says that while you should not favor the poor over the rich in a court of law, you should try, when making laws, show compassion for the orphan and the widow and those who do not have the advantages of the wealthier members of society. So by and large, the Jewish view on taking an active role in legislation and lobbying has been very strongly pro. I tend to go along with that. As I say, the Jewish community is not monolithic, but for the most part, the Jewish tradition has been favoring those kinds of laws.
Well, historically, the Roman Catholic Church has been all over the place on that issue. In some places, we just are the state. and that's, that's worked with, and hasn't, over time some places. And then there are other places where the church has been oppressed by the state, and so there are places where one can't function. So so globally, we live across the both. Here in the United States, again, we have a broad picture. I think there's the famous line from President Kennedy. He said, "Priests and nuns are all Democrats, but bishops and cardinals, those are all Republicans." So it depends on where you are on that. I think and with a certain amount of pride, Catholicism has tried to have an influence in terms of what the broader social issues are in terms of the United States. I would critique, I think from my perspective, sort of how we do that. I'd say we are much better, again, as following my principle this morning. I think we can offer you some really good principles about things. But taking financial advice from beggars is really iffy. I think we can articulate some really strong moral principles and principles that we receive. And I think that's really where we're at our best. I'm not sure that we're particularly good at legislating those. I mean, the legislative process is the art of compromise, is it not? And I'm not sure that we have special gifts in terms of legislation or in terms of I would say, I think those are things that are significant. Just to use a case in point, I think where we did not do a particularly good job, I mean, for a while, the Catholic Bishops' Conference in terms of the recent healthcare issue, they came to a point where every time there was a rewrite of something, they had to issue a statement upon the rewrite. Well, eventually they just stopped because they couldn't possibly even read it, much less know what it is that they were talking about. So I think the question becomes, what should we do in terms of a broad principle? Yeah, I think we have some significant principles to articulate and to hold up to people. How one implements those, I think really how the implements to those really belongs to the folks who've got the boots on the ground. And those are people of faith and people not of faith. I think our goal, what we have to contribute is sort of the wealth of our tradition. The implementation of that's going to be a longer and more detailed process. I'm not so sure I would rely on us for principles of implementation.
I think the people who are in the government and politics, they are out of as well. And the main principle is this one: in God we trust. We show our trust in God. If we are following the God's guidance, then we have to be fair, sincere, and honest to anyone. And we have to devise such a system which is the betterment for the whole country or the whole world or for the humankind. This is the main principle we have to apply, that in God we show our trust, and then we have to follow. Maybe there are some person, maybe they are not believers, are not following the faith as well, not following the God's guidance, but the majority, I think, in the world are those who are following the guidance of God. And finally, we are the creation of God, then we have to follow His teachings, and whatever He gives, that's the betterment, for the betterment of the mankind. So we have to make such laws who benefit us, not to destroy us.
I noted that the panelists here representing capitalism, all of global capitalism, you said that a good or contract from an Anglo-American perspective should basically come down to two parties agreeing to a contract and then abiding by the terms of that contract. But we see in history and in current context that that doesn't always produce results that, honesty isn't the only thing at work here, and that morality needs to be part of business deals. And I think there are a lot of issues where this becomes apparent, such as slavery, where two parties agree to a contract and they may be honest in that contract, but they're dealing with the dignity of the human person. And even today, in business deals, we can still see that when two parties agree to sell the livelihoods of human beings by selling natural resources that should be promoting the livelihoods of many people, but end up being sold among the rich. And this creates a global society of iniquity that creates the very wealthy and the very poor. And I wonder if the different panelists here have ideas on how to not just create a better business climate where people are more honest and more moral, but if there's any way of fixing the problems of the past, which are still harming us today. So how do we deal with the inequalities where some people are starving and struggling just to survive, and some people have, billions of dollars? Is there any radical change that we can take to try and fix that, or is the only solution really to just slowly, moderately, pragmatically become more moral business people?
I guess in terms of the Jewish tradition, we believe realistically, and especially in a political climate like this one, we can't go back and undo the wrongs of the past. Rather, as your second suggestion, if we can move forward, admittedly incrementally, our system wasn't built overnight, and it's not going to be shifted overnight barring a revolution, which is an option that you talked about. But I do think that we need to focus on where do we go from here, and by passing legislation, by creating legislation and passing legislation that will try to promote the conservation of natural resources. One of the things that it does say in the book of Genesis is that humankind was given dominion over the earth, not to strip it bare, but to be the guardian over it. The word to master means to actually watch over, means to be the guardian of the natural resources. And so my own belief, and again, this is shaded by my own political leanings, and I admit to being somewhat biased, is that our tradition would support the notion of taking care of resources, taking care of all people who, as both of my colleagues have said, and I've said too, are created in the image of God. But as far as going back and massive changes to bring us all immediately up to the level playing field and making up for past, admittedly bad things that the government has done, I don't really see that happening realistically. I think what we need to do, and the Jewish tradition would support this, is to move forward with all deliberate speed to try to make our society the most just that it can be.
The issue, the point that you raise is a significant one because it's, a deal honestly kept, the purpose of which is to do evil, is of no value at all. The question becomes, again, what is the good? And the Catholic tradition says we start with the individual person, and then second area has to do with the common good, and things must serve the individual person in the sense of common good. Now, we've been saying that for about 2,000 years, and I'm not sure that we've been particularly successful in being able to promote that. And so I think we have some issues to continue, I think, at this point, because those are still overriding principles that I'm not sure on which everybody agrees, quite frankly. And, Thomas Aquinas years ago said, well, there's two goods. There's the moral good and there's the political good. The moral good is that which you should do, and the political good is the art of what's possible. And I think it's difficult for us to incrementally move the political good up to the moral good. I mean, have you ever been to Rome? Have you ever driven in Rome? Well, a stop sign in Rome is it's a suggestion. I mean, if there's somebody in there and you stop, that's a good thing. But if there's nobody there, why would you stop? So it's in some ways, I think, as we look at the relationship between the law and the good, it's the question, we have an ideal in terms of what's good. And I think the question is, I don't think that's universally shared. I'm not sure that people would say that the purpose of the economy is to promote the common good, and the significance and the importance of the common good is the reiteration of rights that I suggested at the outset. I'm not sure that that's an agreed upon principle yet. But the issue is political. We live we just had the Abrahamic faiths here. There are a number of others, and then there are people who are not religious faith. We're in a pluralistic society, a pluralistic world. And I think the hard slogging of political resolution has to do with, can we find, interreligiously and as people of goodwill, common ground upon which we can begin to base a system. If we don't do that, and we continue not to do that, then it's going to be, then we're going to be in the flood, and, hope you have flood insurance.
We have to think that the present situation is because of our actions. What we have made the laws, what we have done, that is the result of our actions and programs and the system. So are we successful in that system and program and all those actions? So we have to look upon our past and what is our future program. So we have to sit together regardless of faith, either we are believer or non-believer, where we are living, we have to sit together and think what is the result of our past, what we are going to do in the future, and what is the best and good for the mankind in the future. This is the principle we have to apply. And also I started saying, quoting the word of God, you work together on the basis of righteousness and piety, and do not work together on the basis of sins and transgressions. The program you are giving to the world, it creates a loss and damage to the human society. That's not good one. which is obvious for us. So we have to think and ponder what is our future program, and results are there, actions are there, then we have to devise another system which is useful for the humanity.
It seems that what the religious tradition can give us is specifically a concrete concept of the common good. But it also seems that not a lot of people in the economic system right now are religious. And globally, it's a global problem, the economic problem. Is it possible to have a secular concept of the common good, or can we only have a specific religious concept of the common good? In which case, then, how can we have it shared? So I'm wondering, maybe this is a good question to the responder. Do we have a secular concept of the common good?
I'm not sure why that's a good question for the responder.
Wait, you mentioned,
That's part. This is out of my field, so I'll just say briefly. It's a huge debate within American political science and political theory about how can a pluralistic society, is it just a bunch of ad hoc compromises, or is it possible to come together on a belief? And I think it's somewhat possible that there are broadly held principles and there are principles shared between faith. Implementation, it's been a little sketchy. That's largely, I think, a function of power and the political system that we build. That is, I don't think everybody's opinion of the common good receives equal weight. But that's really a philosophical question that's beyond my academic training and personal scope.
One of our big topics that we discuss frequently, not only within our Temple community, but certainly within the Grand Valley community, and I think it took wing during the 2008 presidential election pre-primary, was whether you can be a morally upright person without being religious, which I think is what your question now. Even though I am firmly convinced and a faithful believer in Jewish tradition, I have always thought that some people that I know who I regard as the most morally sound folks are either agnostics or non-practicing members of a religious faith, or just people who don't talk about religion. So my own answer, and I'm not quite sure how to go about doing it, was that yes, I think that in a secular society, a pluralistic society like the United States, there should be a way of reaching common ground in terms of philosophical principles that would promote, to use Father's term, the common good. The problem is defining what we mean by the common good. But yes, I'm an optimist, I guess, in that sense, that there should be a way for people of goodwill to get together and agree on something like that.
Well, the question you ask is the question of the Enlightenment, isn't it? And I think, honestly, the jury's still out on the Enlightenment, but and how enlightened it is. It is but I think that's, sure, is that, do we have any other choice, at this juncture? We live in a broad world. But not just do we not have any other choice, I think from my Roman Catholic perspective, we would say, well, all people are made in the image and likeness of God, whether they know it or not. Whether, if a non-believer is made as much in the image and likeness of God as a believer, whether they know this or they don't know this. And the graces and benefits are there, whether they're aware of it or whether they're not aware of it. We're not different species. I think we have different levels of understanding and awareness of that and different ways in which we'd attribute to it. But is it indeed possible? Yeah, from our basic operative principle, of course it is. Of course it is. Now, I think the ongoing motivation the ongoing drive between that is because we are made in the image and likeness of God, and so that enables us to do that. But whether you hold that or not, that idea or not, yeah, I think what other, at this point, what other choice do we have? I mean, in a vast pluralistic world. And if we don't do that, if we don't engage in that sort of dialogue, then we are in the flood, aren't we?
I think it's not a matter of belief or non-belief, secular or being religious. The main principle is this one, that the world can exist if someone who is ruling as an unbeliever. But world cannot exist, or the rule or government cannot exist when there is a transgression and injustice. When transgression and injustice is being committed, then there is no system, no government. But as far as the human being is concerned, if he or she is a non-believer and doing the justice, I think he or she will prevail and the system is good for the humanity. This is the main principle, and we will like that the person who is representing the world or the country, he should be a believer one under the guidance of God. But main objective and aim is this one, how being a believer or being a secular, how we can serve the creation of God, the humanity in a better way, and that world becomes better and peaceful and flourishing.
Sir, did you still have a question? No? Good, Gerardo.
The Anglo-American commercial law. I wonder if the financial institutions do realize that when the Titanic sailed from Plymouth, there was the first class, second class, and those on the deck. But when it hit the iceberg, they went together. Whether you were in the first class or second class or on the deck, the seawater came and we all sank. Prior to the Anglo-American commercial law, it's obvious that economics, which cannot be separated from financial systems, could be traced in the ancient Greek society and ethics of Aristotle. To surmise, Aristotle said that the ultimate purpose of politics and the theory of economics is the good of man. Here, I think he's talking about anthropos rather than a gender name. Anthropos, humanity. We also tend to forget that Adam Smith, before his Wealth of Nations, was a moral theologian, and he wrote the theory of moral sentiments. So how can we be so influenced from the moment of the Enlightenment, if it was so, for us to divorce ethics or morality from financial transactions or economics? We've heard about individual responsibility and accountability and the collective common good of society. Ethics is not an individual principle, just as language is not an individual principle. In ethics, there is one thing that one can do or one ought to do, and one ought not to do, or one may do or may not do. How does Wall Street and the financial systems overlook this important aspect?
Well, I should be able to attribute this quote. First, I used to do public health, and one of the things I used to do was epidemiology. And actually, one of the famous epidemiological kind of comparisons is actually the death rates on the Titanic. And the rich actually survived at a much higher rate than the people in steerage. Which I think supports your point, doesn't contradict it. But, I can't answer why. The quote is that never underestimate someone's ability to ignore what they're highly paid to ignore, or words to that effect. Professor DeWilde has repeated in my presence at least 5 times the story of the testimony of one of the bankers in Congress who said, we want regulation because we can't help ourselves. If the music is playing, we have to dance. So I'm not defending that. I'm stating that that's reality, and then the question I have in my head is, can we change that reality through political means, through regulators, putting, if necessary, one behind every single banker, or is the project somehow rebuilding a common vision of the common good that reaches all the way down to the future generation? And my view is kind of one of a pessimistic view of moral erosion. I think it's hard to unring that bell. And so we ought to put people on the leashes that we think are appropriate. I think that's unfortunate and not the preferable route, but I think that's the reality that we face now, and we need to look, and that means some kind of a political route informed by the kinds of traditions that you've mentioned, Greek philosophical traditions as well as the religious traditions that we've heard about today. And I hope we get it right.
Supplementary question.
Cool. See if
I
anyone.
realise from what we've heard here among the panelists that we live in a pluralistic society, and there are hurdles to go over to overcome a consensus. But stretching this further in the global context, the financial crisis cannot be divorced from the Economic and Social Committee of the United Nations, under which the IMF and the World Bank operates. And so the universality of the problem, or the common good again, is it not possible that all religions, in addition to those who are not believers, to present a common front for the sake of humanity?
Does anyone want to respond to the supplemental question?
I think I'm off on this one.
I would simply respond, certainly, see why not? But I'm not prepared to philosophically argue point at this time, but no, that certainly, yeah.
Well, it's, well, you can, I think, but the question is who's listening? You know, I think and I don't think the major religious traditions have, have been quiet. I think major religious traditions have been speaking about these issues for a long period of time. And so I don't, and perhaps we're not very effective, and maybe we're a testimony that we're not essentially as effective as we might be. I think the question becomes, and this is, the point is, how is it that where does that find traction? Where does it find gripping points, within things? One could look at, regardless of the ideals, one would have to look at the United Nations and say that it probably does not live up to the ideals that generated it, or what we anticipated, that they can say a great deal, but what ultimately occurs is really quite distinct and apart from that. So it has to do with the receptivity to be able to be engaged in the discussion. And I'm not sure that everybody is listening at this point.
I think we have to be inclusive, not exclusive. We have to think where we are wrong, and the laws which are made, how they are being exploited, and that law is not enforced and not giving us the good fruit. So therefore, we have to revise everything, whatever is doing damage to us. This is because in the beginning there was only one human being, and then there's a development of human being. Then there are laws. Step by step, we have to make laws. If one law, and laws are being made by the human being. And if the law which are given by God we follow and sincerely and honestly, I think there will be a success. But we have to think which is benefit for us and which does not benefit. This is the thing. But as far as the religious traditions are concerned, they are all for the good and betterment of the humanity under the believing in God. They have to do best of their ability, and everyone has to do the best of their ability as well.
Thank you. Would you join me in thanking our panelists?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to see you.